Story: The weight of the unseen chest. The sun hung like a heavy gold coin over the parched plains of Magadha, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to pull at the heels of those who walked the dusty path toward the city of Rajgir. Among the travelers moved a merchant whose physical frame was bent low, not by the visible gravity of his years, but by the psychic density of a massive wooden chest he refused to relinquish. Within the internal theater of his mind, this chest contained the sum of his identity, a collection of ledgers, deeds, and heirlooms that he believed anchored his existence to the shifting soil of the world. Each step was a negotiation with exhaustion, a rhythmic struggle where the breath became a ragged servant to the preservation of the past. Sitting beneath the sprawling canopy of a banyan tree, the Buddha observed the merchant not as a man carrying a box, but as a consciousness attempting to freeze the flow of a river by clutching a single handful of water. The merchant stopped before the silent figure, his eyes clouded by the salt of his own sweat and the deeper haze of his anxieties. He looked upon the Buddha and felt a strange, unsettling lightness emanating from the seated form, a quality that contrasted sharply with the leaden reality of his own shoulders. In that moment of intersection, the merchant's mind began to unravel the logic of his burden. He realized that the weight he felt was not produced by the wood or the metal of the chest, but by the frantic mental effort required to project a sense of substance onto things that were already in the process of decaying. The ledgers were rotting in the humidity of the monsoon. The ink was fading into illegibility, and the very concept of ownership was a ghost haunting the corridors of his awareness. The Buddha did not move, yet his presence acted as a catalyst for a profound internal dissolution. The merchant perceived the movement of the wind through the leaves above and saw it mirrored in the flicker of his own thoughts. Realizing that neither the wind nor the thought could be held without causing suffering, he saw that he had been walking for 40 years while carrying the corpses of moments that had died long ago. The structure of his ego, which he had built so carefully out of acquisitions and memories, began to appear as a fragile scaffolding over an abyss of pure changing energy. He understood that the chest was not behind him or on him, but was a construction of his own refusal to accept the ending of things. As this realization deepened, the tension in his muscles did not simply relax. It vanished as the conceptual necessity for the burden evaporated. He stood in the dust of the road, his hands finally falling away from the iron handles. The chest remained on the ground, a mere object of wood and shadow, while the merchant felt the vastness of the sky enter his chest. He looked at the road ahead and saw it not as a distance to be conquered, but as a continuous unfolding of the present where nothing needed to be carried because nothing could truly be kept. His mind, once a cramped room filled with the clutter of yesterday, expanded into the open forest. The heavy silence of the afternoon became a symphony of release, and as he walked away, leaving the chest for the termites and the wind, his gait was no longer that of a man driven by fear, but of one who had discovered that true power lies in the grace of letting go. Story: The architect of the sand mandala. The river Ganges flowed with a silent, predatory grace near the outskirts of a small village in the kingdom of Kashi, its waters carrying the silt of 1,000 distant mountains. On its muddy banks, a young seeker spent his days constructing an elaborate city out of wet sand, carving intricate spires and delicate bridges with a focused intensity that bordered on the divine. To him, this city was not a mere plaything, but a physical manifestation of his internal quest for order and perfection in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. He guarded his creation against the wind and the stray footsteps of animals, his mind constantly vibrating with the stress of preservation. The Buddha walked slowly along the shoreline, his footprints appearing and disappearing in the damp earth like echoes of a silent song. He paused to watch the seeker, observing how the young man's brow furrowed with every ripple of the tide that crept closer to the fragile walls of his sand kingdom. The seeker's awareness was entirely localized within the boundaries of his creation, making him a prisoner of his own artistry. He did not see the vastness of the horizon or the eternal movement of the water. He only saw the potential for loss. As the evening shadows lengthened, a large wave, pushed by the rising moon, swept over the bank and dissolved the city back into a featureless mound of gray sludge in a single indifferent stroke. The seeker let out a cry of profound despair, his hands clawing at the water as if he could retrieve the form from the formless. In that moment of devastation, he felt the weight of 1,000 failed efforts pressing down upon his heart. The Buddha stepped closer, his shadow falling gently across the ruined sand. He did not offer comfort in the traditional sense, but instead allowed his presence to mirror the inevitable fluid nature of the river itself. The seeker looked up, his face contorted by the agony of his attachment, and found himself looking into eyes that held the stillness of a deep well. He began to perceive that his suffering was not caused by the river, but by his own attempt to impose a permanent meaning onto a transitory medium. His mind had been a builder of prisons, mistaking the temporary arrangement of grains for a lasting home. He saw that the beauty of the city lay not in its duration, but in its very capacity to disappear. This realization acted as a silent blade, severing the cords of his psychological burden. The city was gone, yet the space it had occupied was still there, and the seeker found that he was no longer required to defend it. The heavy responsibility of being a creator and protector vanished, replaced by a cool, expansive clarity. He looked at his hands, still coated in the mud of his vanished dream, and felt a sudden, inexplicable joy in their emptiness. The movement of the Ganges was no longer a threat, but a teacher, showing him that life is a series of appearances that require no grasping. His mind shifted from the narrow focus of the architect to the broad awareness of the witness. He understood that the burden he had been carrying was the impossible desire for things to stay as they were. As he stood up and turned away from the river, his heart felt as light as the foam on the crest of a wave. The night air was no longer cold but refreshing, and the path back to the village seemed to open up before him like a new world. He walked with the rhythm of the water, a man who had lost a city but had gained the entire universe. Story: The Keeper of the Falling Petals. The forest monastery of Jetavana was a sanctuary of emerald light and whispering bamboo, where the humid air carried the scent of wet earth and the faint, sweet rot of fallen jasmine. Among the resident monks lived one whose entire spiritual existence had become tethered to the preservation of the monastery gardens. A man whose mind functioned as a meticulous ledger of every budding leaf and every fading bloom. To him, the garden was not a living process, but a static ideal that he felt a crushing responsibility to maintain against the inevitable encroachment of decay. Each morning, he walked the narrow dirt paths with a heart constricted by the anticipation of loss, his eyes scanning for the first sign of a yellowing edge or a drooping stem, as if these natural transitions were personal failures. The internal structure of his awareness was a rigid architecture of anxiety, a heavy scaffolding built to support the weight of a beauty he believed was fragile and in need of his constant protection. He perceived the passage of time as a thief, and his meditation had become a desperate attempt to freeze the world in a state of perpetual peak. One afternoon, While the heat of the sun pressed down upon the grove like a physical hand, the monk observed the Buddha seated beneath a massive sal tree. The Buddha remained perfectly still, while all around him, the forest was in a state of violent, quiet transformation. Leaves were falling, insects were consuming the bark, and the very blossoms the monk had spent the morning tending were beginning to curl in the oppressive warmth. As the monk watched, he felt the immense burden of his self-appointed role as the guardian of the permanent. His mind began to oscillate between the sight of the serene teacher and the sight of the dying flowers. And in that tension, a profound realization started to germinate. He saw that his suffering did not emerge from the death of the flowers, but from the psychological energy he expended in his refusal to let them go. He was carrying the garden not in his hands, but in the deep recesses of his ego, where the concept of the garden had replaced the reality of the garden. The Buddha's presence acted as a silent mirror, reflecting the monk's own internal rigidity back to him as a form of self-imposed imprisonment. The monk perceived that the Buddha did not exist outside of change, but was the very embodiment of a consciousness that moved in perfect harmony with it. The heavy weight in the monk's chest, the responsibility for the eternal, began to dissolve as he accepted the radical momentariness of all phenomena. He understood that a flower is not a thing that exists in time, but is itself a brief and beautiful event of time. The need to preserve vanished, and with it, the frantic metabolism of his anxiety slowed to a peaceful rhythm. He saw that the garden was most alive when it was allowed to die, for its death was the very soil from which the next breath of life would emerge. The scaffolding of his mind collapsed, leaving only the vast, open space of the present. He no longer saw the yellowing leaves as enemies, but as graceful participants in a dance that required no choreographer. His breath, once shallow and defensive, expanded to include the entire forest. The burden of the garden was gone, and in its place was a lightness that allowed him to finally see the beauty of the bloom without the shadow of its end. He sat down near the Buddha, no longer a keeper of petals, but a witness to the infinite flow. Story: The Monarch and the Mirror of Rust. In the heart of the kingdom of Kosala, within a palace of white stone that seemed to defy the sun's glare, a powerful ruler lived in the grip of a silent, existential terror. His burden was not the administration of his vast territories or the weight of his golden crown, but the psychological gravity of his own legacy. He had spent decades commissioning monuments of bronze and granite, carving his name into the very bones of the earth in a desperate attempt to anchor his identity against the eroding tides of history. To the king, his sense of self was inextricably bound to these static images, and he viewed the inevitable weathering of the stone as an assault on his very soul. His mind was a fortress under siege, constantly scanning the horizon for the dust of decay, his internal narrative dominated by the need to be remembered as something unchangeable. This obsession manifested as a heavy, metallic density in his consciousness, making every gesture of his life feel like a performance for a future audience that had not yet been born. One evening, the Buddha arrived at the palace gates, walking with a simplicity that seemed to mock the ornate grandeur of the royal court. The king received him in a hall lined with statues of his ancestors, figures whose sightless eyes of obsidian seemed to demand the same permanence the king so craved. As they sat together, the king looked at the Buddha's face and saw a landscape of lines and shadows that spoke of a life lived fully in the flux of the present. He noticed the way the light played across the Buddha's skin, revealing the subtle, constant movement of life within the form. In the presence of such profound equanimity, the king's mind began to confront the absurdity of his own striving. He realized that he had been attempting to turn his living consciousness into a cold, inanimate object. The statues in the hall were not extensions of his power, but heavy anchors dragging him into the depths of a past that no longer existed and a future that was a mere phantom. He perceived that the I he was so fiercely protecting was not a solid entity at all, but a shimmering continuum of experiences, thoughts, and sensations that had no fixed center. The burden of being a king, of being a hero, of being a name, began to peel away like layers of old, dry skin. He saw that the rust on his bronze statues was not a sign of failure, but the earth reclaiming its own, a process as natural and as necessary as the breath leaving his lungs. The psychological energy he had used to maintain the fiction of his permanence was suddenly released, flooding his awareness with a sense of spaciousness he had never known. The monuments outside the window no longer looked like triumphs, but like heavy stones he had finally set down. His mind shifted from the frozen image in the mirror to the vibrant, shifting reality of the moment. He understood that by trying to live forever through his legacy, he had forgotten how to live at all. The silence in the hall became a living presence, and the king felt the boundaries of his ego soften until they were as porous as the air. He was no longer the monarch of a kingdom, but a participant in the vast, unfolding mystery of existence. The heavy weight of his name vanished, leaving him with the simple, profound dignity of a man who knows he is a part of everything because he is no longer trying to be something apart. As the Buddha departed, the king remained in the darkening hall, not as a statue in a palace, but as a light in the wind. Story: The Weaver of the Spectral Silk. The village of Vaishali was a tapestry of vibrant markets and quiet courtyards, where the air was often thick with the scent of jasmine and the rhythmic thrumming of wooden looms. Among the artisans lived a master weaver who had spent 3 decades creating a single, magnificent garment of silk that he believed would be his ultimate testament to the world. This cloth was not merely a product of his labor, but had become the very fabric of his identity, a psychic weight that he carried within the hidden chambers of his heart as he walked through the dusty streets. His mind was a complex loom where the warp of his pride and the weft of his fear of inadequacy were constantly interlacing, creating a mental garment that was far heavier than any physical object could ever be. He lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, terrified that a single snag in the silk or a drop of rain would unravel the entire meaning of his existence. The internal structure of his awareness was characterized by a painful contraction, a narrowing of focus that excluded the warmth of the sun and the laughter of his neighbors in favor of the microscopic perfection of his threads. He perceived the world as a series of threats to his masterpiece, and his burden grew with every year he spent refining the pattern. One morning, the Buddha walked through the village, his presence a silent invitation to the stillness that exists beneath the noise of ambition. The weaver, clutching the bundle of silk to his chest, found himself standing before the seated teacher near the central well. As he looked at the Buddha's simple, patched robe, he felt a sudden, jarring dissonance between his own exhaustion and the effortless grace of the figure before him. In that moment of quiet observation, the weaver's mind began to deconstruct the logic of his obsession. He realized that the silk was not a source of beauty, but a cage he had woven for his own spirit. The perfection he sought was a static ghost, a refusal to acknowledge the vibrant, changing nature of the reality that surrounded him. He saw that the very act of trying to complete the garment was an attempt to stop the flow of time, a futile effort to find a finality that did not exist in a world of constant transformation. The Buddha did not speak, yet his very being radiated a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. a state where no single thread could be separated from the whole of existence. The weaver perceived that his silk was already part of the earth, already part of the wind, and already part of the decay that would eventually claim it. The heavy burden of his masterpiece began to lose its density as he accepted its inherent transience. The psychological tension that had held his mind in a grip of iron for 30 years suddenly snapped, and he felt a wave of relief that was both cool and expansive. He looked at the silk in his arms and saw it for what it was, a beautiful, temporary arrangement of energy that required no defense. He laid the bundle down on the stones of the well, not as an act of abandonment, but as an act of integration. His mind, once a cramped room filled with the dust of his own making, opened up to the vastness of the sky. He walked away from the well with a light step, no longer a weaver of spectral silks, but a man who had discovered that the only true masterpiece is a mind that is free to move with the changing world. Story: The Scholar and the Satchel of Shadows. The road leading toward the rocky heights of Vulture Peak was a steep and winding ascent, carved into the ancient stone of the mountainside where the air grew thin and cold. Along this path struggled a scholar of the Vedas, his frame nearly doubled over by the weight of several large satchels filled with heavy palm leaf manuscripts. These texts represented the accumulation of a lifetime of intellectual labor, a vast library of definitions, arguments, and lineages that he believed constituted the sum of his wisdom. Within the theater of his mind, he was not a man walking on a mountain, but a guardian of a sacred fortress of words. His every thought a defensive maneuver designed to protect his conceptual certainties from the erosion of doubt. The burden he carried was not merely the physical weight of the leaves, but the psychological density of his own need to be right, a leaden pressure that made every step a labor of the ego. He perceived the world through the narrow lens of his categories, mistaking the map for the territory and the description for the experience. As he reached a small plateau, he found the Buddha seated on a flat stone, looking out over the valley where the mist was beginning to rise like the breath of the earth. The scholar collapsed onto the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands still clutching the leather straps of his satchels as if they were lifelines in a turbulent sea. He looked at the Buddha, who carried nothing but a single bowl, and felt a surge of resentment mixed with a deep, unacknowledged exhaustion. In the silence that followed, the scholar's mind began to mirror the vastness of the mountain view, and he realized that the words in his bags were like dry leaves in a storm, incapable of providing shelter from the reality of change. He saw that his intellect had become a wall rather than a window, a heavy accumulation of shadows that blocked the light of direct perception. The Buddha's stillness acted as a catalyst for a radical internal shift, allowing the scholar to perceive the emptiness that lay at the heart of all his carefully constructed doctrines. He understood that truth was not something to be collected and carried, but something to be lived and released in every moment. The burden of his knowledge began to evaporate as he realized that the more he knew, the less he actually saw. The weight in his chest, the pressure of being a master of texts, dissolved into the cool mountain air. He saw that he had been spending his life building a cage out of beautiful sentences, and the door was now standing wide open. He loosened his grip on the satchels, and as they slid to the earth, he felt a sense of lightness that was almost terrifying in its purity. He was no longer a scholar defined by his library, but a consciousness free to experience the world without the mediation of memory. The valley below was no longer a concept to be analyzed, but a living presence to be felt. His mind, once cluttered with the debris of 1,000 arguments, became as clear and as silent as the peak itself. He understood that the greatest wisdom was not the addition of ideas, but the subtraction of the self that clings to them. As the sun began to set, casting a long shadow over the abandoned manuscripts, the scholar stood up and walked toward the edge of the plateau, his heart finally empty and his spirit finally full.